Today, we are going to dive into one of the most important principles in all of Islamic jurisprudence, the sanctity of human life. Now, this isn't just a nice moral idea, it's a very strict legal rule, and it's got a deep and detailed framework behind it. We're going to break down exactly how this rule works, what its very specific exceptions are, and the legal philosophy that holds it all together. And we're going to do it by analyzing a single powerful statement from the Prophet Muhammad. So let's get right into it.
So here's our roadmap for today's deep dive. We're going to start with a bedrock rule, the sanctity of life, just to get our foundation straight. Then we'll look at the specific prophetic statement, or hadith, that lays out the only exceptions to that rule. From there, we'll see how scholars pulled out these critical legal principles about things like certainty, societal need, and maybe most importantly, who has the authority to act. We'll then wrap it all up by looking at the role of community and summarizing all these core ideas.
All right, Section 1, the sanctity of life. Before you can understand any exception, you first have to really understand the rule itself. In any good legal system, there's a default position, kind of like the idea of being innocent until proven guilty. Well, when it comes to human life and Islamic law, that default is absolute protection. This is our starting point, and everything else flows from here.
So you might be asking, what actually makes human life sacred in the first place? And this isn't just a philosophical question. The answer establishes a really powerful legal baseline of inviolability. You have to think of this baseline as the lens through which every other ruling is viewed. It creates a super high barrier that can only be crossed in the most extreme, rigorously proven, and carefully defined situations.
And here is that core concept. The foundational principle is known in Arabic as isma. This word means protection, immunity, inviolability. What it means is that by default, a Muslim's life is shielded by the law. It can't be harmed, and it can't be taken. This isma is the legal and moral assumption that we have to start with, always, no exceptions in any conversation about this topic. Okay, so now that we've established the absolute rule, let's look at the primary text that jurists go to when they need to understand the exceptions. This isn't based on someone's opinion or a later interpretation. It's rooted in a specific, incredibly precise statement from the Prophet Muhammad that lays out the whole framework. And in Islamic law, these prophetic statements, or hadith, are a primary source of legislation, second only to the Quran itself. This is the hadith. It was narrated by the companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was famous for his deep knowledge. It's recorded in the most authentic collections, which gives it huge legal weight. It reads, لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث الصيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس وَالتَّارِكُ لِدِينِهِ الْمُفَارِقُ لِجَمَاعَةٍ. We're showing it in the original Arabic first, to respect the precision and the authenticity of the source text.
And here is the direct English translation. I want you to notice the really precise legal language here. It starts with this huge negation, is not lawful. This just reinforces that default rule we were talking about. Then, it uses a tool of exception, except for. This structure tells jurists that the list that's about to come is exhaustive, it's restrictive. There are exactly 3 reasons, and only 3.
So let's just lay them out one more time. First, a married person who commits adultery, and the status of married is very specific. Second, a life for a life. This is the principle of legal retribution for intentional murder. And third, a person who both forsakes their religion and actively separates from the community. Now, these aren't just 3 simple rules. As we're about to see, Islamic scholars analyze these points to pull out a whole set of profound legal principles that govern justice, proof, and authority. For the rest of our time, that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
And that brings us to Section 3, where we get into the really interesting legal analysis. See, scholars don't just read these exceptions as a simple list. They extract these underlying legal principles or juridical benefits that then inform the entire legal system. We're going to start with the first 2, which deal with the burden of proof and the whole purpose of the law itself.
The very first principle scholars pulled out is certainty, or al-yaqeen. This is a huge maxim in Islamic law that says certainty is not overcome by doubt. And its application here is its most serious. It means the default sanctity of life is so strong, it cannot be overturned by suspicion, by accusations, or by guesswork. To even think about one of these exceptions, the legal system demands absolute, undeniable proof. We're talking things like 4 direct eyewitnesses to the act of adultery or a free confession with every single legal condition met and 0 mitigating factors.
So the second principle answers the question, why? Why these 3 things specifically? The answer is that these punishments are not seen as arbitrary at all. They're understood as part of a bigger framework of protecting the very foundations of society.
The entire purpose of Islamic law, the Sharia, is considered to be the preservation of 5 essential things: religion, life, intellect, lineage, and property. And these specific punishments are directly tied to that higher goal. This table lays out that connection perfectly. The punishment for a married adulterer, well, that's seen as protecting the necessity of lineage and honor. It's about preserving the family, which is the core unit of society. The life for a life principle directly protects the necessity of life itself, providing justice and acting as a powerful deterrent. And finally, the ruling for someone who forsakes religion and community is seen as protecting the necessity of religion, which, in this framework, is the source of a society's shared values. Okay, moving right along to our next section, let's explore 2 more crucial principles that come from this text. The first one is about what these exceptions tell us about the severity of the actions themselves. And the second one, which is, you could argue, one of the most important takeaways for ensuring justice, tackles the question of who actually has the authority to carry out these sentences. Just think about the logic for a second. If the default rule is the absolute sanctity of life, then the very act of singling out these 3 exceptions sends a really powerful message. The law is basically saying that these specific acts are so destructive to the fabric of society, to family, to life, to the community, that they are the only things that weren't overriding that most fundamental protection. They aren't just personal sins. They're seen as crimes that threaten the entire social order. And this leads us to an absolutely pivotal question. The Hadith establishes the legality of these punishments, but only under extremely specific conditions. But does that mean any individual, if they think they saw one of these things happen, can just carry out the punishment? Who has the right to act? The answer to this question is what separates a system of law from total anarchy. And this is the 4th and maybe the most critical principle of all. The Hadith does not give a green light for vigilante justice. Jurists are unanimous on this. The authority to apply these punishments is reserved exclusively for the legitimate governing authority, the ruler or their designated judicial system. This is to guarantee due process, a real investigation, a trial, and verification that the extreme burden of proof has been met. Centralizing power like this is what prevents chaos and blood feuds, and ultimately, it's what upholds justice. Now for our 5th and final juridical benefit. This one comes from the very last part of the Hadith, the one who forsakes his religion and separates from the community. That second part, that little clause, is incredibly important. It reveals a deep principle about what holds a society together. So this brings us to that 5th benefit, which is all about that specific phrase, separates from the community. Al-mufariqu lil-jama'a. Now, this isn't just some descriptive add-on. It's a critical legal condition. The Hadith deliberately links the act of forsaking religion with the act of fracturing the community. It's framing this not just as a private matter of belief, but as an act of public sedition that threatens to dissolve the entire social and political body. And here's why that link is so crucial. Within this legal framework, a shared religion is seen as the fundamental glue that holds the community, the jama'ah, together. It's the basis for the social contract, public morality, and shared identity. So to publicly abandon that foundation and actively work against it is seen as a direct attack on the unity and stability of the whole society. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. So in our final section, let's pull all these principles together and see the complete legal framework in action. Because understanding this logical flow, from a core rule all the way down to its strict application, is really the key to the whole philosophy here. This slide lays out the 4-step process beautifully. 1. You always start with the foundational principle that life is sacred and cannot be violated. 2. You acknowledge that there are only 3 very narrow and strictly defined exceptions. 3. You demand the highest possible burden of proof, absolute certainty, to protect against any mistake. And 4. The authority to apply the law is never ever given to individuals, but is restricted solely to the state, to ensure justice and prevent chaos. So, to wrap it all up, here are key takeaways. The default in Islamic law is the absolute protection of life. The exceptions are not random, they are few, specific, and designed to protect the core necessities of society. The burden of proof isn't just beyond a reasonable doubt, it's absolute certainty. And finally, the implementation of these laws is the exclusive right of a legitimate state authority to prevent vigilantism and ensure due process for everyone. And that leaves us with one final question to think about. How does creating such a rigorous, demanding, and restrictive process for the exceptions actually end up making the original rule even stronger? Well, the answer seems to be that by making it so incredibly difficult to override the sanctity of life, the legal system places the highest possible value on it, ensuring that the default principle of protection remains powerful and paramount. Thanks for watching.